A lot of people are really confused with my conviction when I say that Bitcoin is going to $1 million, it's going to $10 million, it's going to $100 million. And I'm so confident that it's going to those prices very likely within your lifetime. I personally think that Bitcoin can go to $10 million within most of my audience's lifetime. Most of my audience is around 30 to 40 years old. If you're a little older, perfectly fine. You'll probably still see Bitcoin at $10 million. If you're younger, you're definitely going to see Bitcoin at $10 million. In this video, I'm going to talk to you based on math. I'm going to go based on different scenarios, and I'm going to explain to you what my thinking behind each growth rate is and how long it'll take for Bitcoin to reach $10 million based on that specific growth rate. Let's get started. The very first thing that I want to talk about is the growth rate in Bitcoin's price. The growth rate is the annual return or the profit or loss on an investment over any 12-month period. So my assumption here is that if Bitcoin were to grow at a certain rate for the next few years, the growth is going to compound and Bitcoin will eventually hit $10 million. So if Bitcoin were to grow at a certain rate, a higher rate, for example, it would grow to $10 million faster. If it grows at a lower rate, it'll take longer for it to reach $10 million. Something that I want to start here with is the M2 money supply in the US. We can see here that in January of 1959, the M2 money supply was at $286.6 billion. So there were $286.6 billion in the system. Today, there are $21.44 trillion in the system. Actually, this is from November 2024. It hasn't been updated since then, but maybe higher by now. So let's assume that it's at 21.4. This number has grown by about 8% per year. So if the money supply is growing at 8% per year, you can basically assume that the minimum growth rate for any investment that actually works as a savings account, so you can keep your money in it and you can ensure that it will probably retain its value over time, it has to grow by at least 8% per year. This growth compounds over time, and you're going to notice that at some point, the M2 money supply is going to grow by more than the total amount of money in the system in 1959 on a monthly basis. So let's say from month to month, the amount of money in the system is going to grow by $286 billion. And we're not very far from that. So you know for a fact that the amount of money in the system is going to grow and grow and grow. And a lot of it is going to chase assets. So we have, for example, the S&P 500. S&P 500 is seen as a great investment, but it returns about 10%. If the M2 money supply is growing by 8% and the S&P 500 is growing by 10%, you're making 2% on top of the inflation rate. So this is basically the inflation rate. The inflation rate doesn't show up as 8% because we get better at producing things over time. So the inflation rate seems lower, but in reality, prices should be coming down because we get better at making things. So if the same amount of money existed in the system forever, we'd see that prices come down because we get better at making things. More production means more things enter the economy, demand is fulfilled, and prices fall. The next thing that I want to show you here is the S&P 500. We can see here that the S&P 500 is up 1,280% since January 29th, 1993. This average return is around 8 to 10%. So this is almost exactly matching the M2 money supply. If you just look at this chart and you don't look at the amount of money in the system, you might be misled and you might think that the amount of money that you have is growing massively. You just made 1,280% for free, and all you had to do was put your money into the stock market. But the reality is a little bit different. Every dollar that you had back here in 1993 was worth a lot more than every dollar that you have today. So you can buy fewer and fewer things with the same money. So if you have $100 back then, maybe you could buy a bunch of different things. Today, you can buy nearly nothing. In my personal life on a day-to-day basis, I noticed that my expenses since 2020 have gone up about 50%. And if we take a look at the S&P 500, we can see that in that same period, 5 years, it's up 84.46%. And this is what leads to the massive wealth gap. The people who are able to save, the people who have the privilege of being able to save, are able to buy the S&P 500, while the people who can't save, the people who are living paycheck to paycheck, They're working 3 jobs just to make ends meet. They have no savings left over. They can't take advantage of this 35% bonus. So what we're seeing is that the poor keep getting poorer and the rich keep getting richer because the rich have more cash flows than they need, and they can put the excess cash flows into investments like the S&P 500, and they can grow their wealth. This chart looks great, but let's take a look at it from a different perspective. I like using this website to compare the prices of different assets, and we can see here that in terms of Bitcoin, the S&P 500 is down massively in that same period. So while you might think that the S&P 500 gave you this great return of 84.46%, if you look at it in terms of Bitcoin, you actually lost something like 90% of your wealth. We can see here that in terms of the US dollar, the S&P 500 was $3,325 in January of 2020. And in terms of Bitcoin, it was worth 0.4 Bitcoin or 40 million Satoshis. Today, one share of the S&P 500 is worth 0.058 Bitcoin or 5.8 million Satoshis. The number on here is outdated. I think this may have been an older number. We can see here that this part isn't updated, but that's okay. I did the calculation on my own. It's worth 5.8 million Satoshis today. If you had put all of your savings into the S&P 500 in 2020, you would have noticed that your wealth has dropped 85% in terms of Bitcoin in that period. So you might look at this chart and you might think that if I just held the S&P 500 over the last 30 years, I would have made a ton of money. The reality is that you wouldn't have made a ton of money. You would have just slightly outperformed inflation because the M2 money supply grew so much. And now I want to show you a very simple calculation that I did for how long it'll take for Bitcoin to get to $10 million. If Bitcoin grows at 8%, which is the M2 money supply, it's going to grow to $10 million in 59.4 years. If Bitcoin grows at 15%, which I would assume that there's tiny bits of movement of wealth from the stock market into Bitcoin, from real estate into Bitcoin, you would see Bitcoin reach $10 million in 33 years. If Bitcoin were to grow at 20%, where you'd see more movement from the stock market into Bitcoin and from real estate into Bitcoin, as well as bonds, gold, all these other assets, Bitcoin is going to reach $10 million in 25 years. If it grows at 30%, you're going to see it get to $10 million in 18 years. If Bitcoin's price grows at 50% per year, you'll see it grow to $10 million in 11.3 years. I think after this, the estimates just get ridiculous. At 60%, you see it get to $10 million in 10 years. At 70%, it takes about 9 years. At 80%, it takes about 8 years. At 100% per year, it takes 6.5 years for Bitcoin to reach $10 million. I think what we're going to see in the coming years is that more and more people are going to move their wealth from all of these legacy assets that are so difficult to maintain. They're giving them lower returns. Why would you want to hold something that has a higher amount of work required and it gives you a lower return? There's no reason to buy real estate as a savings account anymore. People would normally buy houses in order to rent them out to other people. They would keep buying them. They would keep buying them because they thought that housing will outperform the dollar. So instead of saving in the dollar, they just bought houses and they kept buying more and more, and it bumped the prices up to the levels that we see them at today. What I think is going to happen is that people are going to see Bitcoin as a superior asset. It's a better way to save for the future. So they're going to move their wealth from the housing market into Bitcoin. We're going to see that this number is going to drop a lot further from where it is today. At one point, a house cost 64,000 Bitcoin. I've said this before. I'm going to say it again. It cost 64,000 Bitcoin at one point. If you saved that Bitcoin back then instead of buying a house, today you could buy 15,000 houses. 64,000 Bitcoin is worth $6.4 billion. At that time, the US dollar price of a house was $214,000. So you would have bought something that's worth $214,000. You would have given away 64,000 Bitcoin, and you would have lost the majority of the amount of money that Bitcoin should be worth. And as newer generations don't want to buy houses, they pretty much lose hope because houses are so expensive. They start putting money into Bitcoin. We're going to see that there's lower and lower demand for houses. The world is completely changing. We're able to work from wherever we want to. A lot of people are digital nomads, so they don't have to live in the house that you're offering them. So let's say, for example, you bought a house 20 years ago. What happens if nobody wants to live in your neighborhood anymore? The prices start falling. There's a lot of maintenance and repairs required for housing. You have to borrow tons of money. There's a lot of risk related to it. So more and more people are going to opt out of buying real estate as a savings account as soon as they figure out what Bitcoin is. So now if we go back to these numbers, we're going to see that people who are passively buying real estate and stocks today are going to start diverting some of their funds from those real estate and stocks into Bitcoin. We already saw this with people buying bonds previously, now buying real estate as an investment, and real estate prices have bumped up significantly. We're probably going to see people start borrowing money against their houses and borrowing money against their stocks using a margin account to buy Bitcoin because Bitcoin is the fastest horse in the race. I personally think that Bitcoin growing at 50 to 60% over the next 10 years is not unreasonable because 99% of the supply will already have been mined by 2035. What this means is less and less supply is going to be going into the market, and more people are going to want Bitcoin. So I really wouldn't be surprised if Bitcoin goes to $10 million by 2035, 2036. As more people figure out how Bitcoin works, they're going to want to accumulate it. And at some point in the future, this opportunity to buy the best money in the world is going to disappear. We're not going to have this opportunity anymore. I personally think that my estimates there were conservative. 8 to 15% shouldn't even have been on that list. I think the minimum return over the next 10 years is probably going to be at least 30% per year. As more and more people figure out how Bitcoin works, the price will rise, and the people who own Bitcoin today have less of a reason to give away their Bitcoin because the price has gone up so much and the things that they actually want on a day-to-day basis have gotten so much cheaper for them. So instead of having to spend 0.1 Bitcoin, now they can spend 0.01 Bitcoin or 0.001 Bitcoin. At some point, the only way to accumulate Bitcoin will be either to sell things for it or to offer your time, your labor, your energy in exchange for Bitcoin. Today, if you're earning about $30 per hour, you can buy about 0.0003 Bitcoin for every hour of work. When Bitcoin is at $10 million, maybe your wage will have jumped to $60 an hour. At that point, you're only going to be able to buy 600 Satoshis. So today you can buy 30,000 Satoshis. When Bitcoin is at $10 million, you can buy 600 Satoshis for the same hourly wage. As more people catch on, I'm telling you, there will be demand. I would strongly suggest that you start buying Bitcoin before the US government starts announcing that it's going to buy Bitcoin, because that's going to push the price up on its own. Every single company in the world, every single individual, every single government is going to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Every single person in the world is going to save in Bitcoin. We're going to be using Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis. That could be through transactions on the base layer, maybe through transactions on Lightning or Liquid or some other layer 2 or layer 3 technology that takes congestion off the base layer, but eventually we're all going to be paying each other in Satoshis. So it's up to you whether you buy Bitcoin before that happens or after. Before governments figure out how Bitcoin works and start accumulating as much as they possibly can, or after. Before every single company in the world uses their cash flows to buy Bitcoin, and then every single one of their employees start demanding Bitcoin. Are you going to do it before then, or are you going to do it after? I think that by the time the world adopts Bitcoin, we're going to see a 20, 30, 40, $50 million Bitcoin. And by then, if you have a goal of reaching a certain number of Satoshis, it's just going to get harder and harder and harder. So stop delaying it. Figure out how Bitcoin works. I'm not even telling you to buy Bitcoin. Just go ahead and start studying it. Put in the time to learn how it works and compare it to other financial systems. Bitcoin is going to completely change the world, whether you believe it or not. If you don't have Bitcoin, nobody in the world will care. They'll continue to buy more. They'll continue to add more to their wallets, and you're going to be left fighting for the scraps.